California has long seemed like fully mapped out territory. Satellites have photographed every meter of coastline. National parks are marked down to the last trail. And in the pocket of every hiker is an app that can pinpoint exactly where that trail starts and ends better than any ranger could. In the museums of San Francisco and Los Angeles, neat rows of placards line the walls. Species, status, extinct, date of last record, such and such. It feels like there are no mysteries left here at all, just a catalog of everything already found, filed away and labeled in tight academic handwriting. And yet, almost half the state is mountains, desert, and national forest, where you can go 100 square kilometers without crossing a single road. Statistics know where county lines fall. They don't always know what's happening inside them. But between the line and the official record and what's actually happening in the forest past the ridge, there's a gap. Sometimes that gap is 100 years wide. Sometimes it's a century and a half. And that gap is exactly where the stories we're about to cover live. Some of these animals have been officially dead for 100 years, and there's no real argument to be had. Science closed the book on them for good. Others are only extinct within the borders of one state, while the species itself is doing just fine a couple hundred miles south, and is slowly, steadily working its way back north. And one case on this list, we saved it for last, proves that sometimes extinct just means we hadn't looked in the right direction in a very long time. And when we finally did, something was still there. The difference between these three outcomes is exactly what makes each story here better than the last. If you like stories where science and legend stand close enough together that you can't quite tell them apart, subscribe. There's a lot more of this coming. And in the comments, tell me, out of these 4 animals, which one do you think is most likely to actually come back first? Let's start with the most recognizable one. The California grizzly bear has been on the state flag since 1846, when a group of settlers raised a homemade banner with a bear on it over Sonoma, the birth of the short-lived Bear Flag Republic, which lasted all of a month, but left behind a symbol that outlived it by 2 centuries. Anyone who's ever seen that flag has already seen this species. Before the gold miners arrived, this was arguably the densest grizzly population on the continent. Under Spanish and Mexican rule, Californians even staged bear and bull fights in arenas. For a California grizzly, that wasn't some rare spectacle, it was just how common they were. Within less than a single generation after the gold rush, the population was wiped out entirely. The last wild grizzly was officially shot in Fresno County in 1922, and the last sighting, no gun involved this time, was recorded 2 years later in 1924 in Sequoia National Park. Case closed, you'd think. The bear lives on, only on the state seal. But right now, exactly a century later, the question is open again, and not in a movie, in actual state politics. In 2024, the California State Senate officially declared the centennial year the year of the California grizzly bear. A coalition of biologists and conservation groups published a 200-page feasibility study arguing that the Sierra Nevada could still support more than 1,000 bears relocated from Rocky Mountain populations that are genetically almost indistinguishable from the extinct California subspecies. The idea has no shortage of opponents, either. Ranchers in the foothills worry about their livestock, and the tourism industry around the neighboring parks points out that a bear that size is more than just a symbol on a flag. It's a real risk to people. And here's the interesting part. Science considers the species completely extinct, and yet in the remote reaches of the Sierra, unconfirmed tales of a ghost bear still surface now and then. Stories from hikers and rangers about a silhouette too big to be a black bear, spotted at dawn and gone into the fog before anyone could be sure. The most recent version of that story is a claimed sighting in Sierra National Forest in 2019. Serious science doesn't back it up, and it was most likely a black bear seen at dusk by someone whose nerves were doing the guessing. But the fact that these stories keep coming is exactly the point. Officially, there's no bear, and the talk about it hasn't stopped in 100 years.
The second animal is even more surprising, because most people are sure jaguars never ranged north of Mexico in North America. That's not true. Verified zoological records place jaguars in California as far north as Monterey. There are documented sightings from 1814 and 1826, hundreds of miles north of what's normally considered their range. And in the Tehachapi Mountains, in the mid-1800s, researchers found the only known den in the United States with a breeding pair and cubs. Until 1860, the jaguar in California wasn't a visitor. It was a permanent resident and the top of the local food chain. California isn't some strange exception here either. In the 19th century, jaguars were recorded well north of where people usually assume the species' range began, all the way to the foothills of Colorado and the coast of Louisiana. That entire northern range collapsed within roughly a single century of heavy hunting. After 1860, there are no more confirmed California sightings. But the species didn't go extinct. It simply retreated south into Mexico, Arizona, and New Mexico, where hunting and later development did nearly as thorough a job as it had in California. And yet, since 1996, 7 individual jaguars have been documented across Arizona and New Mexico combined. One of them, a male nicknamed El Jefe, held territory in the Santa Rita Mountains for several years and became, by most accounts, the most filmed wild jaguar in U.S. history. Another male, nicknamed Sombra, Spanish for shadow, by local school children, showed up on camera a few years earlier in the Huachuca Mountains, a couple hundred miles to the east. Every new appearance follows the same pattern. Young males regularly make it up into the southern U.S. on their own, but it takes a female to turn that into an actual population instead of the occasional wandering male. And in 2024, researchers documented the first evidence in decades that one might be present. The one thing standing in the way of the species naturally working its way back north isn't biology, it's geopolitics. The border barriers between the US and Mexico are increasingly cutting off the very corridors jaguars have used for centuries. So the claim that a jaguar could return to California isn't tabloid talk, it's a sober forecast from biologists. And it depends less on the animal itself than on whether it's ever given the road to do it. We're halfway through the list, and it only gets better from here. Coming up is a butterfly that scientists literally tried to bring back from the void, and an animal that proved should theoretically still be out there can just mean is out there. If you've made it this far, now's the time to subscribe. There's plenty more where this came from. Next is a more fragile story, because this time we're not talking about an animal the size of a person. We're talking about an insect the size of a fingernail. The Xerces blue butterfly once lived on the sand dunes of San Francisco, its wings shimmering blue lavender in a way found nowhere else on Earth. Witnesses described its flight as low, almost skimming the ground. Nothing like the fluttering of a typical butterfly, more like a blue spark gliding between the stems. As the city grew, the dunes were paved over block by block, and the butterfly's host plant disappeared right along with them, until, in 1941, an entomologist collected the last known specimen of the species. It was one of the first insects in U.S. history whose extinction was traced directly to urban development, rather than pesticides or climate change. For decades, scientists argued over whether the Xerces blue was really its own species, or just an isolated population of a similar butterfly, the silvery blue, which is still common up and down the West Coast. In 2021, genome sequencing of museum specimens that had sat in collections for almost 80 years settled the question. Yes, it was a distinct species, one that split from its closest relative at least 850,000 years ago, which means the loss was real, not a filing error in some old taxonomy. And then in 2024, something happened that doesn't fit the usual "extinct means forever" script. Scientists from the California Academy of Sciences released dozens of butterflies from that closely related species in the Presidio, on those very same dunes, not to pretend the Xerces blue was back, but to get its empty ecological role in the local pollination chain working again. Not everyone in the scientific community is thrilled about the approach. Some entomologists call it more of a symbolic gesture than a real restoration of the species, since genetically, it's still a different butterfly wearing a similar shape. But even the critics agree it's more honest than quietly crossing the species off the list and forgetting the empty niche it left behind. There's no formal cloning involved. What there is a living experiment still running right now, about as close to resurrection as science can offer without a time machine. And finally, the story worth sticking around for. In California, the wolverine was considered wiped out starting in the 1920s. The last confirmed sighting dated to 1922, the same year as the last grizzly ever shot. For the next 86 years, biologists kept hearing accounts from perfectly credible people about sightings in the Sierra, but not one piece of proof, not a single photograph, nothing you could put in front of a journal reviewer. The exact situation we opened with. Officially, the species is gone, and the rumors never stopped. In March 2008, a graduate student named Katie Moriarty was setting up cameras for a completely different study. She was trying to photograph martens for a project connected to the U.S. Forest Service. One of the photos turned up a wolverine instead of a marten. The first documented wolverine in California in 86 years, and a total shock to Moriarty herself, who, by her own account, hadn't expected anything like it. They nicknamed him Buddy. DNA analysis showed he'd most likely walked all the way from Idaho's Sawtooth Range, a journey of hundreds of miles through several states, on his own. Buddy lived in the Lake Tahoe area until at least 2018, claiming a territory of roughly 300 square miles and turning up on camera dozens of times. The footage racked up more than 350,000 views when California's Department of Fish and Wildlife posted it online. Then, in 2023, cameras around Yosemite and Inyo National Forest caught a different, new individual, a young male, apparently looking for territory and a mate of his own. The wolverine is already one of the rarest predators in North America to begin with. Across the entire lower 48 states, there are only a few hundred of them left in total. Every new individual in California isn't just an addition to some larger population, it's a federal-level event. And there's a troubling side to this story, too. Wolverines need snowpack that stays deep and dense all the way into spring to den and breed. And the Sierra is warming faster than most of California's other mountain ranges. So even a confirmed presence is no guarantee the animal is here to stay. The species' return could turn out to be just as temporary as its absence was. In other words, the exact phrase we opened with, should theoretically be out there somewhere, turned out, in the wolverine's case, to be not a legend, but a fact, backed up by a photograph. It just took 86 years and one camera placed somewhere it wasn't meant to be. Here's the distinction worth remembering. Extinct in a state record is just the date of the last confirmed sighting, nothing more. Sometimes there's genuinely nothing behind that date, like the butterfly on the dunes that science will never see alive again, only its ecological shadow wearing another species' wings. And sometimes it's just territory nobody has looked at closely in a very long time, where one lucky trail camera shot can rewrite a 100-year-old record overnight. California looks like a fully mapped out state on paper. Satellites, trails, apps, tidy museum placards. But a map is only what we've already found, not what's actually out there. No satellite, no app can see into the places where animals that officially shouldn't exist still occasionally wander through. The Sierra Nevada, the dunes of the Presidio, and the mountain ranges along the Arizona border still hold the difference between what's written in the record and what's actually out there where the trail ends. The thing we keep calling a ghost bear, simply because nobody's come up with a better name for it yet.